In this clip, we will examine a game mechanic called a screening action. A screening action is a special ability that certain NATO maneuver units possess, most especially U.S. armored cavalry units, but also certain reconnaissance units in other NATO armies. Let's identify what we mean by a cavalry unit. A cavalry unit is any maneuver unit in a U.S. armored cavalry squadron or a British armored reconnaissance regiment. Referring to the TO&E charts for NATO in the Würzburg game, we can see here all units of the 2nd Squadron of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in the box on the right. Note that only the maneuver units, the M1 Abrams units and the M3 Bradley units, shown inside the red outline, are termed cavalry units and therefore eligible to screen. The headquarters unit and the artillery unit belong to an armored cavalry formation, but they are not considered cavalry units. Referring to the TO&E charts for NATO in the 5th Corps game, we can see the entire 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in the box on the right. Again, only the maneuver units, the M1 Abrams units and the M3 Bradley units inside the red outlines, are termed cavalry units and therefore eligible to screen. It's worth emphasizing 2 points about these units. The first is that the term cavalry unit applies to both the M1 Abrams and the M3 Bradleys in each squadron, even though only the Bradleys show the unit symbol for armored cavalry. Both types of units are referred to as armored cavalry or cavalry in this video and in the rules based on the type of formation they belong to, not their specific unit symbol. The second point is that the M2 Bradley unit shown on the left and the M3 Bradley unit shown on the right bear the same Bradley vehicle silhouette, but these are completely different unit types. M2 Bradley units bear a mechanized infantry unit symbol and are treated as infantry for all purposes. M3 Bradley units bear an armored cavalry symbol and are treated as armor for all purposes. M2s are found in armor and mech brigades and cannot screen, while M3s are found only in armored cavalry squadrons and can screen. Now, let's take a look at how screening works. The basic principle is that whenever a Warsaw Pact unit moves adjacent to a NATO unit eligible to screen, after the contact procedure has been run, the NATO player can declare a screening action. If it succeeds, it stops the movement of the Warsaw Pact unit. It's done, and the NATO unit is allowed to execute a retreat of 1 hex. If the screening action fails, then the Warsaw Pact unit can continue its movement, and no further screening action is possible as long as the moving unit remains adjacent to the armored cavalry unit. A failure would then allow the Warsaw Pact player to bring up the rest of the regiment and complete its operation here. So let's look at how this works in this example. The Warsaw Pact player is executing a hasty attack operation with the East German 4th Tank Regiment, and Warsaw Pact player names as his objective this U.S. Armored Cavalry unit. So his first unit enters 1, 2, 3. Each player reveals the number of step markers underneath his unit. Since this is a real unit and doesn't go poof, the NATO player declares that he will indeed conduct a screening action. So the NATO player refers to the screening table, where he takes a look at the terrain that his armored cavalry unit is in. And in this case, the armored cavalry unit occupies light woods, which means that a screening action will succeed on any die roll but a 1. Were the armored cavalry unit in a clear terrain hex, he would only have a 50-50 chance of making a screening action work because he doesn't have much cover. If he's in any other type of terrain, this is likely to be close terrain and therefore not quite as easy to conduct a screening action, which is involving that unit falling back, which is tougher to do in dense terrain. But it would still succeed 80% of the time. So in this case, the NATO player rolls a 5, and on a 5 the screening action succeeds, which means that this unit has now completed its movement, and the armored cavalry unit must retreat 1 hex. And whenever it conducts a screening action, whether that action is successful or not, it must flip to its use side. It is now committed to holding this corridor. Now at this point, the Warsaw Pact player has a choice. He can do one of two things. He can keep the objective hex where it is, which would enable him to move his remaining 2 units up, and then during the advance step of the operation, he could advance 1 or more of those units into that empty objective hex. Alternatively, he can say, okay, my objective hex is now empty, and whenever an objective hex is empty, the active player has the option of placing it somewhere else. So there is no requirement that the Warsaw Pact player place the objective marker here. If there were another NATO unit that he could get to, say here, then he could potentially put his objective marker there. But in this case, there is only the armored cavalry unit, so he moves his objective marker onto the armored cavalry unit again. So now he enters his second unit, 1, 2, 2.5, 3.5, and again, the contact procedures run, and the NATO player says, okay, I'm going to run another screening action and try and halt you. So he rolls the die roll is a 5, the screening action succeeds, and the NATO unit falls back again, and the Warsaw Pact player says, all right, I'm going to keep chasing you, so he moves his objective marker, and his final unit goes 1, 2, 3, 4. The NATO player again says, I will run a screening action. This time he rolls a 2, but that still succeeds, so this unit falls back. During the advance step of the operation, this unit can advance into the objective hex. At this point, the NATO player can once again run a screening action. Doesn't matter whether an enemy unit moves adjacent as a result of movement, or advance after combat, or a retreat. The NATO unit always has the option to screen. There is one exception to the NATO player's ability to screen, and that is if an armored cavalry unit holds its ground in the objective hex and then retreats out of it as a result of enemy offensive fire, then it does not get a chance to screen the Warsaw Pact player when his units advance into the objective hex. If he retreated out of the objective hex as a result of a successful screening action, then he can screen again. So in this case, when the Warsaw Pact player advances in, the NATO player has the option to conduct a forced screening action. The NATO player declines to do that because he hasn't run the activation cycle for the 2nd Squadron of the 11th ACR, and therefore when he does, he's now adjacent to this enemy unit, and he's hoping he can pull off a strike on it. And that's how screening works. Let's look at a few of the conditions for executing a screening action. A cavalry unit can conduct a screening action regardless of whether it is unused or used. It can conduct a screening action whether it is in the objective hex or whether it just happens to be adjacent to an enemy unit that is moving without the cavalry unit being in the objective hex. It can conduct a screening action whether the Warsaw Pact unit is entering an adjacent hex as a result of movement, advance after combat, or in fact entering the hex as a result of a retreat from an enemy action. It can even execute a screening action if it is located in an obstacle hex. A cavalry unit cannot attempt a screening action if it is disrupted. It cannot conduct a screening action if it is stacked with a non-cavalry unit. So in this case, if it were, as an example, marked as the objective hex and the Warsaw Pact player moved here, regardless of which of these two were the objective, this unit could bounce back. But if it were stacked with a non-cavalry unit or a cavalry unit from a different squadron, then it would not be eligible to conduct a screening action. A cavalry unit can also not conduct a screening action if it happens to be located in a minefield. There are two other conditions where a NATO unit is ineligible to conduct a screening action, so let's take a look at those. One of them relates to the concept that when a NATO unit attempts a screening action and it fails, it cannot conduct another screening action during the rest of the movement of the enemy unit it was attempting to screen. So in this case, the Warsaw Pact player goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Then this NATO unit here attempts to screen. If that fails, the Warsaw Pact unit is completely free to continue with its movement. So it could go 5, subject to infiltration fire, and 6. It would not be able to conduct any further screening actions against this unit. However, if the Warsaw Pact unit moves away, then when the second unit moves on, 1, 2, 3, 4, then this NATO unit would be eligible to conduct another screening action, because at this point it is not pinned by an adjacent Warsaw Pact unit. On the other hand, if the Warsaw Pact player had chosen to keep this unit here, the presence of an adjacent enemy unit, even one that is in the current operation, prevents this unit from conducting a screening action. Its location is now known, which means that when this second Warsaw Pact unit comes in, this unit is not eligible to screen. There is one other case where a unit is not eligible to screen, and that is if screening would put it in the position of having to retreat next to an enemy unit. So in this situation, for example, if the Warsaw Pact player had just finished the movement of this regiment, and then another regiment were to enter the map, 1, 2, 3, 4 to here, then this NATO unit would not be eligible to screen, because anywhere that it retreated would be adjacent to an enemy unit. And that covers all of the conditions for when a cavalry unit can screen or is barred from screening. It's also important to note that a dummy unit cannot screen. And the reason that a dummy unit cannot screen is that the contact procedure is always run first. So when this Warsaw Pact unit moves adjacent, contact procedure is run, and if this NATO unit is a dummy, it's going to go poof before it ever gets a chance to screen. So dummy units don't get a chance to screen. Let's look at a number of edge cases. In this example, the 22nd East German Motor Rifle Regiment is executing its planned hasty attack, and the Warsaw Pact player names as his objective hex this Bradley unit here. So he enters his first unit, 1, 2, 3. Contact procedure is run. Everybody indicates what they have by way of steps, and then the NATO player declares that he is going to execute a screening operation with this armored cavalry unit, and it succeeds, halting the Warsaw Pact unit's movement and forcing this unit to bounce back a hex. It then becomes used. However, this unit is now adjacent to its objective hex. Nothing stops it from attacking. So the remainder of the regiment can move on, and it could complete its attack on this objective. Let's look at another edge case. In this example, the 170th Guards Motor Rifle Regiment is executing its planned hasty attack operation, and it indicates that it will make this American armored cavalry tank unit the objective. And for its first unit's move, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 into this hex. It is now just moved adjacent to 2 armored cavalry units. So what are the NATO player's options? He has the option to conduct a screening action with either or both of these units. So if he chooses to conduct a screening action with both units, then whatever happens is going to happen to both units. Now, one of these units is in light woods and one of these units is in heavy woods. The rules enable the NATO player to always use the best terrain. So if he elects to screen with both of these units, he would consult the screening table and he would see that the light woods are his best option because the screening action will succeed on any roll but a 1, and so he can use that column for the screening die roll. If the screening action succeeds, then this Warsaw Pact unit is halted and both of these units must drop back, and they would both flip to their use side. If the screening action failed, then this unit would not be used immediately, and it could continue its movement. It was 3, 4, and it could go 5, 6, with neither of these units able to screen. So let's just presume for the sake of argument that the NATO player said, all right, when you first move next to me, I'm not going to screen with this unit, but I will screen with this unit. Then in this case, the NATO player would roll on the light woods column, and if it succeeds, then it would bounce back, and this unit would be completed, and this unit would also be flipped to its use side, but this unit would remain here. Now when the Warsaw Pact player goes to move his second unit, he could either pursue this cavalry unit or he could pursue this cavalry unit, which is unable to retreat now because it's pinned by an adjacent enemy unit. Let's go look at another edge case, and this involves retreat fire. So in this example, the NATO player has activated the 1st of the 3rd Brigade, and he elects to conduct an assault operation with this unit as his objective. So he forms a task force, and this unit moves 1, 2, and this unit moves just 1 and into place. Let's assume that the result of this assault operation is that this Warsaw Pact unit has to retreat. It is now retreated into the ZOC of this armored cavalry unit. The NATO player has a choice. He can either conduct retreat fire, because this enemy unit has just retreated into the ZOC of one of his units, or the armored cavalry unit could conduct a screening action and attempt to retreat. The NATO player cannot do both. He can either conduct retreat fire or conduct a screening action, but he must make a choice. All right, that concludes our clip on armored cavalry and screening actions.